This presentation is part of my ongoing research on the specific field of the architectural periodical and its role in the formation of the architectural discipline, in the context of my PhD studies at the Birkbeck College London and the work conducted for the R&D project The Site of Discourse at the Institute of Art History of the University Nova in Lisbon and the Institute for Science and Technology, ISCTE, also in Lisbon. The study, coordinated by the architect historian Ruth Figueiredo, includes a full survey of all the architectural periodicals published in Portugal throughout the 20th century. This paper draws from some of the issues that arise from the particular study of the architectural magazine and the understanding of it as a deeply transformative tool for the communication and dissemination of ideas on architecture and its cultural makeup. Tied to the theme of this conference, my paper focused on the overall thinking and representation of architecture in a number of specialized magazines in Portugal, namely A Construção Moderna, A Arquitetura Portuguesa, Arquitetos and Arquitetura. I will discuss how these architectural magazines shaped the debate around national identity and how this correlated to the debate about modernity and ideas of modernization. In the first half of the 20th century, the question of a national architecture was entangled with the question of modernism. Through the first decades, both notions were sometimes easy to identify and separate, although not always. This presentation asks the following questions. What are the ideological forces that stand behind the distinction between modernism and nationalism? And how do these differences give shape to distinct architectural approaches? This is a debate that only became relevant retrospectively thanks to the role of architectural historians and critics. In fact, by looking more attentively to these early magazines, we see a more nuanced discourse where the words and definitions of modernity, tradition, classicism, and nationalism are used interchangeably and have different meanings to the ones we attribute today. Thanks to the first historiographies of the artistic production of the first half of the 20th century, and as these histories grew in number and outreached their initial scope, soon became evident the plurality and ambiguity of modernity as a single movement. The idea of multiple modernities or competing modernisms has made new theoretical approaches possible while raising new questions. The writings of architectural historians and thinkers such as Alan Colquhoun, Kenneth Frampton, or Keith Agener, to mention just a few, invite us to discuss the long-established diversification of modernity within a trans-regional and, by implication, transcultural perspective. Through the examples of the following magazines, we will see how terms such as modern, modernism and their opposites, tradition and classicism, were used with different meanings and for different purposes. By looking into their historiographical rooting in the context of the architectural magazine, the aim will be to discuss the usefulness of explaining and categorizing the creative processes associated with the event of modernization in architecture, and in this case in particular, its relation with the cultural and artistic construction of a nation-state. The genesis of the architectural periodical started both with the coverage of issues concerning architectural history or construction technology within dedicated sections of the general press, as well as in journals specialized in arts and letters. Dating back to the beginning of the 19th century, they were mostly dispersed in nature and authored by non-specialists in the subject matter. The increasing number of periodical publications in Portugal followed the trend of what was also happening in Europe, which saw its first publication specifically address the subject of architecture appear in Weimar at an even earlier date in 1789, and in France in 1800 with the Journal des Bâtiments Civils et des Arts. It was the French magazine Revue Générale d'Architecture et des Travaux Publics, initiated in 1840, that consistently set up the blueprint for the specialized periodicals that were to follow it. In Portugal, like elsewhere, the first specialized press appeared thanks to the institutional bodies of the workers' guilds and associations. The first periodical fully dedicated to the subject of architecture, or in better words, to cover the component subjects that eventually became an integral part of the discipline of architecture, started its first circulation in 1865 and was called Arquivo de Arquitetura Civil. It belonged to the Royal Association of Civil Architects under the direction of Posidónio Silva and aimed to merge sciences with the arts, including masonry and the decorative arts, as well as history and philosophy, in an attempt to forge a deeper understanding of architecture as a discipline that would go beyond the mere act of building. Following the Arquivo in 1874, a second attempt by the Royal Association of Civil Architects, and now also of archaeologists, culminated in a bulletin dedicated to these two fields of knowledge, and which was also directed by Posidónio Silva. But like its predecessor, it was mostly concerned with issues of architectural heritage and associative life, and remained for the most part, even in its subsequent series, devoid of any critical stance on the more contemporaneous issues of the profession. At the turning of the century, and following the aforementioned attempts to publish a specialized periodical, came the bulletin Anuário in 1905. By then, the Royal Association had given way to the Society of Portuguese Architects, founded in 1902, after the official accreditation of the Statute of the Architect by an Act of Government on the same year. The bulletin was short-lived due to the challenges of publishing a strictly official magazine in such an inconsequential context and for such a small community. The publicity and exposure this new media offered either eluded or scared its potential contributors, despite the several efforts of its editors. The importance of creating an official magazine, besides the obvious help in forming a professional discipline, also included the advantage of helping to promote a national agenda and to reinforce the institutions that make up a functioning state. These early magazines followed the traditionalist models practiced in the fine art academies, and its artistic and intellectual practices responded mostly to a monarchic vision of the state, where architecture, in its incipient hybridized form, was expected to elevate the status of the building and client accordingly to the hierarchy of the social model. Right at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, an independent architectural magazine was born, called A Construção Moderna. The turn of the century saw a significant improvement in the publications devoted to the field of architecture, not necessarily in quantity but quality, in part thanks to the magazines and bulletins which paved the way to a stronger professional stance. Despite of the fact that in all the previous editorial projects and statements we could perceive an, an increased will to modernize the profession, it's in its first editorial that the editors commit to keep up with the endless progression and improvement of the construction industry and to report and reflect upon the progresses happening both nationally and internationally. Until then, there was a clear deficiency in the production of sufficient theoretical analysis and material to energize the creative minds of readers and practitioners alike. The new A Construção Moderna was, however, an improvement in comparison with the previous cases, particularly thanks to the regular features of projects by several authors showcasing different typologies of buildings, from a series of public works to engineering projects, and in their own words, therefore rendering the magazine a repository of useful work, open to endorse anyone who would be willing to submit their work. It is essential to say that at this point, few, if any, magazines had a particular editorial angle or a strong vision of what their publications could become. A Construção Moderna was not different. Its modernity conformed more to an attitude than to an aesthetic. Having the word modern in its title was not evidence of a particular idealistic goal. On the contrary, its pages often featured the ideal models of an architecture which was Portuguese in its essence, even if this was often acquired through added symbolism and cliché. Otherwise, what a Construção Moderna offered was the constant support to the professional practice, watching over its integrity, raising any issues thought of as relevant to its community and society while fabricating a sort of national architectural rebirth. In sum, a Construção Moderna contributed to the problematization of what meant to be an architect and a citizen in modern times, albeit within a local perspective which was increasingly concerned about the implications this process of modernization was having over the sense of national identity, as we can see in the many features showcasing what were considered the best archetypes of the Portuguese house. In this context, the expression modern should be understood in correlation with the terminology used since the late 19th century when referring to buildings which served either new functions or were associated with technological advancement, many times coupled with ideas of hygiene and efficiency, such as rail works and train stations, hospitals, sports and health facilities, postal office buildings, and so on. The interest a Construção Moderna showed for these innovative projects, new typologies, and technical achievements was always more prevalent than the need to assert the cultural value of national, artistic, and cultural production. In this sense, a Construção Moderna was less concerned with more significant issues pertaining urban and social development at a local level. Instead, it remained an elitist magazine mostly concerned with the stylistic nature of private buildings and commissions. However, it was this dialogue between technology and architecture that increasingly characterized and distinguished the direction of this magazine from its predecessors. Eventually, a Construção Moderna, with the ambition of continuing to be a quarterly magazine, plus the merging with another magazine dedicated to metal works, and the death of its two major directors, became mostly focused on technical matters and progressively lost its depth of analysis and cultural and artistic relevance. In 1909, the developer and journalist Mário Colares, who was also the creator and director of a Construção Moderna, decided to publish a second magazine called Arquitetura Portuguesa, also aimed at the building industry. Similar to a Construção Moderna, the magazine Arquitetura Portuguesa, besides publishing a few important buildings of the time, was mostly concerned with featuring family houses where the figure of the architect or the builder was delegated to a second plan, drawing attention to the house owner instead. In general, both magazines were superficial in their choice of projects and in how these were documented and analyzed. However, Arquitetura Portuguesa had, in comparison with the Construção Moderna, a much better graphic quality. This was due to the role and prominence given to photography in the magazine, with its high quality pictures presented individually in separate sheets. Both a Construção Moderna and Arquitetura Portuguesa are a reflection of the optimism of the First Republic in Portugal. They speak of modernizing the city, they display new visions relating to the decorative arts, with special emphasis given to the Art Nouveau movement, and primarily reported on new technologies regarding the construction industry. The Arquitetura Portuguesa featured with great prominence the work of the Portuguese architect Cassiano Branco, who is considered to be a pioneer of the modern movement in Portugal and who boldly incorporated innovative technical solutions like flat roofs or big plain surfaces and protruded cantilevers. All these features were seen at the time as extremely irreverent, essentially because they broke with the traditional models of most buildings and looked like empty boxes, lacking the elements that would attribute the appropriate symbolic meaning to a building who was culturally grounded and not too generic. At the same time, Cassiano Branco's projects were featured next to other examples, such as the Portuguese Pavilion for the World Fair of 1939 in New York by the architect Jorge Segurado, which followed a more classical and traditionalist approach, with stone moldings and plinths deemed to be more suitable to represent the dignity of a state building. Despite the criticism of not being Portuguese enough, this was a typical compromise of that time, as well as appearing next to projects like the Portuguese House by the architect Ferreira da Costa, displaying the traditional roof tiles, friezes, balconies, and so on. Even at the start of its third series in April 1935, now with a new added title, thanks to the merging with another smaller publication linked to a ceramic factory, the magazine didn't seem to have a strong critical position regarding the projects it featured. If in one hand it showed some curiosity towards new models of architecture, on the other it remained conservative and favorable to more traditional approaches, as we can see in the contrasting examples of the Palace of Exhibits in Paris by Baudouin y Lodz and the Nursery by Francisco dos Santos. Perhaps this was thanks to the belief that somehow between these two models, more authentic and appropriate solutions to the needs of the country could be found. During the third series, the magazine improved substantially its editorial output. That was reflected into the doubling up of the number of pages, the rise of the number of participants, as well as in the gradual shift in its choice of contents, showing a more progressive and creative approach not only to the architecture it featured, but also in the quality of its own design and layout. A arquitetura portuguesa continued its existence for almost another decade, with its fourth edition that lasted until 1958, and that saw a significant change in the format and content of the magazine. It became a radically modern and progressive magazine, fully embracing the European archetype of architectural modernity, and this thanks to the introduction of unbuilt designs, more illustrations, a richer graphic design, which included the change of the magazine's own layout into a landscape format, thanks to the contribution of the architect and Royal College educated graphic designer Vitor Paula. In fact, his series was to become one of the most emblematic series in the history of the architectural and periodical design of the 20th century in Portugal. This late series was clearly a reaction against the last official architectural magazine, named Arquitetos, which promoted the most solid form of a conservative and nationalist architecture in clear synchronicity with the program of the Portuguese dictatorship, O Estado Novo. On February of 1938, thanks to the efforts of a sequence of directors of the Portuguese Syndicate of Architects, and after so many years in the making, the first number of Arquitetos was finally out. The publication's main focus was on the promotion of architectural projects in Portugal but also abroad. The latter were often reproduced from other magazines bought or received by the syndicate. It also featured news from the syndical life or other activities such as international meetings, congresses, etc., and provided some bibliographic commentary or texts of a theoretical nature, which were mostly translations of articles published in foreign magazines. One of the most relevant aspects of Arquitetos is the fact that it was a magazine produced by an official body of architects endorsed by the government, a government which was still relatively young and was desperate to establish itself for long-term governance, and which saw an advantage in cultivating an idea of nationhood, emulating similar efforts of neighboring countries that went through identical socio-political developments. This is important because it formatted and the discourse adopted by the magazine and its contributors. If in one hand the magazine was specifically created to help architects express their viewpoints, on the other, this was a freedom which was not yet fully wanted. The syndicate was clear in this point. when it wrote that in those pages it could not be developed any doctrine contrary to the defense of the architects. Nevertheless, it would allow sufficient freedom to the eventual collaborators to expose their opinions, as long as these would align with the fight towards the dignification of the class, and above all, to the enrichment of the artistic patrimony of the nation. Inherent to a magazine that was created to promote the value of a professional class was its own search for legitimacy. One of the visual cues denouncing this need of the editors to be sanctioned by the government is the prominent series of photos of senior dignitaries spread over several pages of Arquitetos. Obviously, back then, the freedom to speak out was naturally conditioned by a circumstance whereby a professional class was still trying to find its voice, a search made even more difficult in an environment where a symbiotic relationship with the government was needed. Thanks to the nature of this relationship and the strong focus on national architectural production, the magazine Arquitetos, throughout the 4 years of its existence, was an important contributor to the construction of an image of national identity, of which the most emblematic example was undoubtedly the coverage of the national exhibition O Mundo Português in 1940, which we see here in issue number 10, which almost exclusively covered it. The buildings displayed a classicist monumentality not dissimilar to the architectures favored by other European dictators. According to several Portuguese historians, namely José Manuel Fernandes and José Augusto França, the main purpose of the exhibition was to celebrate the birth date of the nation, but its second and most important objective was to reinforce the status of the Portuguese fascist regime and to guarantee its foothold in government by appealing to the public sense of national pride and identity. This was achieved by the nature of the the nature of the public commissions as well as by the artistic expression displayed by the magazine. Such an event was guaranteed to get the attention of the periodical press and surely deserved special attention by the class of professionals which was most directly involved in the setup of the event and was ultimately responsible to materialize the vision of a glorified nation. Ironically, the last issue in 1942 and the end of Arquitetos coincided with a recommendation sent by the government to suspend temporarily any printing activity from all the syndicates of the country. This fact is well documented in the history of the Portuguese fascist regime during the war. In order to keep the fragile neutrality of Portugal in the Second World War, Salazar, the head of state, decided to tighten the control of the state over the press and, in his view, to reduce the chances of seeing his diplomatic strategies leaked and undermined. The second independent magazine, also fully dedicated to all the matters concerning construction and the built environment to appear in Portugal, was the independent monthly magazine Arquitetura in 1927. This magazine was to become the longest-lived architectural magazine in Portugal, gaining particular relevance after its second series and arguably becoming the most important architectural periodical of the 20th century in Portugal. The first series, which lasted until 1935, didn't distinguish itself from Arquitetura Portuguesa, the other independent architectural magazine in the country at the time. If anything, it was inferior in the scope of material and in the quality of its presentation. Arquitetura, like its counterpart, focused mostly on private commissions for distinguished customers, where the architects had perhaps a bigger leeway for experimenting their formal repertoire. Arquitetura covered almost exclusively private housing, mostly presented as a question of style. Again, it seemed to be the high status of the client that turned the project or building worthy of news, while the figure of the architect or the builder was obscured. Architecture was talked of almostly exclusively through the use of adjectives. To summarize the first series, one could say that it represented a catalyst of architectural thinking and practice, but still in an incipient form. It borrowed a lot of the discursive jargon from other disciplines such as archaeology and the Beaux-Arts, and was still far from defining a field of action for the profession. Like the other early architectural magazines, its relation to an idea of a national architecture evolved accordingly to the same canons, following an arch that went from an historicist superficial approach to a more classicist and monumental one that better served a proto-fascist government with a conservative, nationalist and colonialist agenda. The first big transformation to take place in the Portuguese architectural press happened with the beginning of the second series of Arquitetura in 1946. The editorial line became much more coherent and the magazine expanded substantially thanks to the inclusion of more projects by celebrated international figures. The coverages grew more extensive and it reunited a dormant dialogue with the fine arts and the building industries. By the mid-century, the Portuguese professional class of architects was confident enough to open itself up to its neighboring disciplines and include in the pages of Arquitetura a more broad outlook of the discipline, opening up discussions about the city, society, the arts, and the new building materials and techniques that allowed for new expressive possibilities. Architecture was by now becoming a recognizable profession, and this invested architects with a new confidence. They were the new educators of taste and could more easily push for an avant garde international architecture, illustrated here by the cartoon The Client's Visit by the architect João Abel. The models of modernist enlightenment were eventually spread and specially adopted by the younger architects who had an increased sense of responsibility towards the physical and social environment that surrounded them. Coupled with their new self-awareness, architects were starting to be able to transform their practice in an act of social duty and a public service. In turn, this helped society to gradually recognize the role architects could play in it. To conclude, I would like to approach the problem of modernity in the Portuguese architectural magazines, and particularly in the transformation of the second series of Arquitetura, by raising and briefly attempt to answer the following question. How did the process of modernization happen in the Portuguese architectural periodical? Firstly, it was a non-revolutionary process because it was not urgent. Portugal didn't suffer from what Michael Macropoulos has described when referring to modernity as an ontological state of emergency, particularly evident in Weimar, Germany, where the famous Bauhaus school was created. With the overthrow of the emperor, the humiliating and economically catastrophic Treaty of Versailles, and the crushing of the attempted communist revolution, which created a nervous, volatile political situation within the new republic, where institutions, norms, and values that had been taken for granted suddenly seemed hopelessly obsolete as point of orientation, where a new historical social space came into existence as a result. This ontological state of emergency was what allowed for a condition of modernity to appear. Secondly, modernity in Portugal didn't necessarily represent radical change. It was closely associated to the country's own timing and condition of being. Modernity in Portugal was perhaps closer to the definition of revolution given by Hannah Arendt. For her, logics of modernity tended to threaten and pervert revolution as a new beginning. Her understanding of modernity was of a revolution as in the sense of revolving, turning to the same point, where a space of total change becomes normal and the present becomes merely temporary and unstable or perhaps elusive. The eclipse of tradition, religion, and authority in modernity opens for Aaron a gap between past and future, where thinking and action can take place. This promise can be realized if and only if a revolution overcomes the conditions that turn revolution into something else. Thirdly, it was slow and self restrained, but still inscribed in the global project of capitalism and economical and social growth. As I have been trying to show, it is easy to see how the second series of Arquitetura and later the third series of Arquitetura Portuguesa had a radical overhaul of their visual and material composition, as well as of their contents, but this did not necessarily mean that theirs was a fundamental rupture with the past, despite the common belief, including by many of the agents involved in these magazines. The new forms, geometries, and techniques, the new ideas about the city and social critique definitely resonated with most avant garde discourses and ideals advanced by like minded architects from similar geographical, cultural, and economical contexts. In other words, the modernity promoted by these Portuguese magazines was inscribed in the networks of architectural dissemination created by a particular web of magazines from equivalent socio-cultural contexts. However, the distinction of the Portuguese context was exactly the restrained approach to novelty. This can be perceived by some as a consequence of an effect of culture produced in a peripheral and small scale context, which is true, but I believe that it is also something that is embraced or even inherent in Portuguese society and culture. This restraint enables the creation of a specific artistic production and philosophical standpoint. The abundance of examples is endless. They can be found in the plain architecture, called Estilo Chão, described by the American historian George Kubler on Portuguese architecture of the 16th century as being clear, ordered, with proportion and simplicity. It can also be found in the numerous articles discussing and moderating the radicality of the international style as proposed by Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, among many others, while introducing ideas and considerations on the vernacular, on tradition, on localism, and regionalism. These discussions produced an interwoven conceptual thought that has been referred to as quiet modernism by historian José Augusto França, and that I would like here to describe as a form of slow modernism. The route to the future in Portugal would have to be slow. Pre industrial forms of agriculture predominated. The Industrial Revolution had not occurred until mid century at least. Mass society was non existent, and in general, economic and social activities were highly dependent on the state. This situation was not conducive to the emergence of a radical newness, either aesthetically or politically, but rather promoted self restraint on the part of most architects. To finalize, and as an anecdote to further illustrate this point, in 1962, Salazar, the Portuguese head of state, wrote to the director of Coca Cola in Europe to explain his opposition to its access to the Portuguese market. It is a matter of what I would call a moral landscape. Portugal is a conservative nation, paternalistic, and, may God be praised, a backward country, which I consider more flattering than pejorative. You would risk introducing in Portugal what I hate most of all. This is modernism and the famous efficiency. I even shudder at the thought of your trucks at full speed on the streets of our old cities, accelerating as they pass the pace of our secular habits. Therefore, the Portuguese were to live at their own tempo, not one accelerated by radical state policies of regeneration or disrupted by what Walter Benjamin called the storm of progress. Eventually, Coca Cola was to enter in Portugal with the demise of the dictatorship in 1974, and whatever form of modernity was adopted before or after, it was, above all, inscribed in the overarching process of globalization, where all modernisms collided in the inescapable pull of the capitalist system. Thank you.